From fated enemies, the maid tried to kill the CEO but ended up becoming his lawful wife. How much can a man truly own if every night he lies awake, unable to claim even his sleep? And how much can a woman truly lose if the only thing she carries is a fragile piece of peace that no one else can see? The question lingered in the air like smoke from an old cigar, dense, inescapable, and faintly bitter. High above Manhattan, Alexander Crane stared at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Midnight lights bled into the Hudson River, a neon heartbeat pulsing across the city. From here, the world looked small. Streets shrank into glittering veins, cars into silver insects, and people into shadows that never touched him. On paper, he had it all. 39 years old, self-made billionaire, CEO of a multinational empire. His net worth climbed faster than the Dow Jones. His penthouse spanned over 3,000 square feet of glass and marble, a place where even silence had an echo. His face graced the cover of Forbes, Fortune, Business Weekly. Strangers toasted his name over dinners they couldn't afford, investors hung on his every word, and competitors either feared him or wanted to become him. And yet there he was alone. The Rolex on his wrist told him it was 1:17 a.m. The bourbon in his glass burned like an old regret, its amber surface trembling every time his hand betrayed the smallest shake. He had bought everything: cars, art, islands, people's loyalty, but not sleep, not peace. Those things slipped through his fingers like water, and the harder he tried to clench his fists, the emptier he felt. Somewhere in the city below, Evelyn Hart tugged her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. Rain had begun to fall, again. In New York, drizzle was a language everyone understood. It was the city's way of reminding you how small you really were. The bus had left 5 minutes earlier, and she had neither the energy nor the money to call a cab. So she walked one block after another until her shoes soaked through and her toes went numb. Her shift at the diner had ended late. The smell of frying oil clung to her hair. The faint sting of bleach lingered on her hands. Most people never saw her. To the suits who ate lunch there, she was just the waitress. To her landlord, she was the tenant who always paid late. To the mirror, she was a woman of 34 with tired eyes and a stubborn spine. But Evelyn didn't mind being invisible. She had once been seen fully and painfully until she lost everything: business, friends, trust. Now she carried herself with a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be measured in dollars: resilience. No man's approval could buy it, and no betrayal could take it away. She had nothing worth stealing, yet inside she owned a steady silence no one else had earned. 2 lives, 2 worlds. One glittering at the top of a tower, one trudging through the puddles of a cracked sidewalk. They had no reason to collide. Their stories didn't rhyme, their paths didn't cross. But fate doesn't ask for reasons. Fate doesn't negotiate. It simply chooses its moment, quiet and merciless. Alexander drained his glass and pressed his palm against the window. The city looked like a circuit board, electricity racing, never resting. He wondered if anyone down there could feel what he felt, this weight of abundance that somehow left him hollow. A man can climb every mountain, yet still wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air. At the same hour, Evelyn paused under a broken street lamp. She lifted her face to the rain, letting the drops blur her vision. She didn't pray for wealth, or romance, or miracles. All she wanted was a morning where she didn't feel like she was starting from scratch again. Just one morning where life felt less like survival and more like living. They were strangers. To him, she was another shadow among millions. To her, he was a name that belonged to newspapers, not real life. And still, both carried the same invisible wound, the fear that no matter what they did, they would always remain misunderstood, unseen, untouched at the core. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. It lets 2 people circle each other for years, building walls of circumstance and pride, only to let those walls crumble in one careless second. That second hadn't arrived yet, but it was close. Soon, Alexander Crane, the man who thought he could purchase destiny, would meet Evelyn Hart, the woman who refused to sell hers. Their meeting would not be soft, it would not be sweet. It would be jagged, raw, and loud, like 2 storms colliding over the same restless ocean. But on this night they knew nothing of that. He poured another glass of bourbon. She tightened her jacket and kept walking. Two lonely figures, breathing the same rain-damp air of the city, unaware that tomorrow would no longer belong solely to themselves. Because tomorrow, fate would stop circling. Tomorrow it would strike. By daylight, Alexander Crane belonged to the world. His name traveled across boardrooms like a currency. His signature could tilt the stock market by 0.5% before lunch. People called him visionary, strategist, self-made titan. His empire stretched across continents: real estate in Dubai, tech investments in Silicon Valley, energy ventures in South America. Every acquisition, every deal, every perfectly timed risk built a narrative. Here was the man who never lost. And yet those who praised him didn't know him. They knew the reflection, the performance, the mask polished until it gleamed. Alexander had perfected the art of presence. He could step into a room of 500 investors and command silence without a word. His tailored suits, custom-fitted in Milan, never wrinkled. His voice carried the kind of conviction that made even skeptics sign contracts. To an outsider, he looked indestructible, a man sculpted from ambition and marble. But marble cracks, too. Behind closed doors, his empire felt less like triumph and more like exile. The penthouse atop the tower was silent, its glass walls framing a city that never touched him. He kept no photographs on the shelves. The art on the walls had been chosen by a consultant, not by taste. Even his wine cellar was curated by an expert, as if he had outsourced pleasure the way he outsourced risk. The truth was, Alexander Crane lived in a museum of his own making, beautiful, expensive, and lifeless. At 39, he still carried a wound from his 20s, a betrayal so sharp it never dulled. She had been the first woman he thought he could trust, back when his company was still a shaky startup and his confidence not yet bulletproof. They had shared late-night ramen dinners, dreams scribbled on napkins, and whispered promises in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. And then one morning she was gone, taking not only his love but also his designs, his early funding contacts, and half of his team. She sold it all to a competitor who crushed him within a year. Alexander clawed his way back. He rebuilt bigger, faster, stronger. On the outside, the betrayal turned him into a legend. On the inside, it carved a hollow that no success could fill. Since then, he trusted contracts more than people, lawyers more than lovers. Women became elegant distractions, escorts at galas, companions on business trips, fleeting, replaceable. He told himself he liked it that way, but the lie grew heavier every year. Sleep was the first thing he lost. Insomnia stalked him like a jealous lover. At 2 a.m., his penthouse lights still burned, spreadsheets glowing across his laptop, the city humming beneath his feet. He tried melatonin, meditation, even Ambien. Nothing lasted. Night after night, he found himself standing by the glass wall, watching a city that never slept, wondering why success felt so indistinguishable from loneliness. To the public, he was enviable. To his board, indispensable. To women at charity events, irresistible. But to himself, he was untouchable in the worst sense. No one reached him, no one stayed. What unsettled him most was how numb he had become. Deals that once thrilled him now felt routine. Victories were measured in percentages, not passion. He had reached the summit but discovered the air was thin, the silence deafening. There were moments, fleeting, embarrassing moments, when he longed for something small, ordinary. The smell of coffee brewed by someone else, not by a machine that cost more than most cars. A laugh that came too quickly, too honestly, without agenda. A voice that didn't echo with strategy but with warmth. He buried those longings beneath quarterly reports and six-figure contracts, but they remained stubborn as scars. Every morning, his driver picked him up in a black Escalade. Every evening, he returned to the penthouse where no one waited. The routine was flawless, seamless, empty. He told himself he had chosen this life, chosen control, chosen solitude, chosen strength over weakness. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the bourbon loosened his thoughts, he wondered if he had really chosen anything at all, or if he was still reacting to that one betrayal from years ago. The city knew Alexander Crane, CEO. The world knew Alexander Crane, billionaire, but no one knew the man who pressed his forehead against cold glass at dawn, fighting back the urge to smash through it just to feel something break. It was into this world of polished surfaces and invisible cracks that Evelyn Hart would soon step. She didn't know it yet. He didn't either. But fate had a way of finding the fissures in marble and pouring itself through. For now, Alexander buttoned his jacket, straightened his tie, and prepared to meet another day. Another set of cameras, another set of admiring strangers who would never guess that beneath the perfect suit, a man was still bleeding from wounds older than his empire. The mask fit well, too well, and that was the most dangerous part. If Alexander Crane's life was made of glass towers and steel contracts, Evelyn Hart's life was carved from grit and loss. She was 34, and most days she felt older. Not from the lines around her eyes, though they had deepened, or from the stiffness in her shoulders after double shifts, but from the years that had taken more than they gave. She had once believed in beginnings. Fresh starts, second chances, the kind of resilience people quoted in self-help books. But life had a way of teaching lessons that no paperback could cover. 7 years earlier, Evelyn had lost everything. Not in the slow decline of poor decisions, but in one violent sweep, like a storm flattening a house in a single night. She had trusted the wrong partner, signed the wrong documents, and watched her small business, the cafe she had poured every ounce of herself into, slip away under someone else's name. Bankruptcy wasn't just financial, it was personal. It hollowed her. It stole her sense of control, her friends, her pride. She rebuilt, but not in the way the world measured. She never regained the cafe, never chased after a second empire. Instead, she rebuilt herself into someone who no longer needed applause to keep breathing. These days, she worked in a modest law office by day and picked up shifts at a diner by night. The law office paid little, the diner even less, but between the two she managed rent and the occasional splurge, a paperback novel from the corner bookstore, a bus ticket to visit her sister in New Jersey. Her apartment was small, the kind of place where the kitchen and living room were separated only by the color of the carpet. Still, she kept it neat, filled with second-hand furniture that carried the faint smell of lemon polish. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Evelyn's strength was quiet, the kind that didn't make speeches or demand recognition. She knew how to listen, how to notice the pauses in people's sentences, how to measure truth by the weight of a silence. She had learned the hard way that not all scars showed on skin, and not every smile meant safety. Unlike Alexander, she didn't suffer from insomnia. When her head hit the pillow, exhaustion dragged her under quickly, mercifully. But her dreams often carried echoes of the past, the clink of coffee cups, the smell of roasted beans, the laughter of customers she used to know by name. Waking up was always a strange relief, another reminder that the dream was gone, but also that she had survived it. She had no use for men like Alexander Crane. She saw their faces on magazines at the grocery store checkout, their names scrolling across news tickers in the diner during the night shift. To her, they were untouchable, untethered, and uninteresting. She didn't envy their wealth. If anything, she pitied the loneliness she imagined behind their headlines. Money could buy everything except honesty, and honesty was the one currency Evelyn demanded. That demand often made her difficult in the eyes of others. She didn't flatter her boss at the law office, even when it might have earned her a raise. She didn't laugh at the crude jokes of customers at the diner, even when it might have earned her a bigger tip. She carried herself with a posture that said, "I've been knocked down, but I'm still standing, and you don't get to push me again." Her sister once told her she was too proud, that life would be easier if she bent a little. Evelyn disagreed. Life might bend her body, her schedule, her bank account, but her dignity, that was hers to guard. And yet, beneath all the steel and resilience, there was a softness she rarely let the world see. She volunteered at the library on weekends, reading to children in voices that made them laugh. She left small tips for delivery drivers, even when her own wallet was thin. She still stopped to look at flowers in the bodega window, though she never bought them. Some part of her refused to give up wonder, even if she no longer believed in miracles. That night, As she folded her apron at the diner, she glanced out at the city's neon blur. The rain had finally eased, leaving the streets slick and gleaming like sheets of black glass. She thought of her old cafe, of the way the morning sun used to hit the windows just right, casting gold across the tables. For a fleeting second, regret pinched her chest, but she shook it off. Regret was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Instead, she tied her hair back, clocked out, and headed into the night. Another late bus, another walk past half-lit storefronts. Another ordinary evening. What she didn't know was that the same city lights she walked beneath were reflected in the penthouse windows of Alexander Crane, a man who had everything and yet nothing. Their lives were separated by wealth, power, and circumstance. But they shared the same city air, the same restless heartbeat of New York. And soon the distance between them would collapse. For now, Evelyn kept walking, unaware that fate had already drawn her name beside his in a ledger she couldn't see. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was not seeking a savior. She was simply living, one step at a time, unaware that each step carried her closer to the collision that would unravel everything she thought she knew about strength, trust, and love. Because sometimes the strongest walls are built not to keep others out, but to test who cares enough to break through. And Alexander Crane, though she didn't know it yet, was a man who had been waiting his entire life to find a wall like hers. There are meetings that feel like inevitability. Others arrive like storms. For Alexander and Evelyn, it was the latter loud, jarring, and impossible to ignore. It began on a Thursday, the kind of day when the city's rhythm carried an impatient edge. The rain had returned, harder this time, hammering against umbrellas and turning sidewalks into slick mirrors. Evelyn was late leaving the law office, papers tucked under her arm, her hair plastered damp against her forehead. She had agreed to drop off documents at a client's building, one of those towering monuments of glass and power in Midtown Manhattan. She hated these places. The lobbies gleamed like airports, full of men in sharp suits who didn't notice the women mopping the floors beneath their feet. Alexander Crane's name was etched in gold across the entrance. She hadn't noticed at first. To her, it was just another skyscraper owned by a man she'd never meet. She signed her name at security, collected a visitor badge, and followed the directions to the 51st floor. The elevator opened into silence, the kind of silence that carried weight. The receptionist's desk was empty, her chair still spinning slightly as if abandoned in haste. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the folder and stepped inside. And there he was, Alexander Crane. In the flesh, she knew the face from magazines. Sharper in person, though, less polished, more human in a way that startled her. He stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tight. The skyline framed him like a portrait, a man carved out of power. Evelyn had every intention of leaving the folder on the desk and disappearing, but the receptionist was gone, and Alexander turned just as she crossed the room. His eyes, gray, sharp as ice, locked on her. "Who are you?" His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory, clipped. "I'm here to deliver these documents." She lifted the folder slightly. "For who?" "For Mr. Dempsey from Halpern and Lowe." Something flickered in his gaze, suspicion or annoyance, it was hard to tell. "You don't leave sensitive contracts lying around. That desk is unsecured." Her patience was already thin. The rain, the overtime, the long climb just to stand here and be interrogated. "Then perhaps you should instruct your staff to be at their desks instead of leaving visitors stranded." The words slipped out before she could weigh them. She regretted them instantly, but it was too late. His brow arched, as if no one had spoken to him that way in years, maybe decades. He hung up the call without a word, stepped forward, and took the folder from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and something sparked, not soft, not romantic, but electric, like the snap of a live wire. Evelyn stiffened. He noticed. "You should be more careful," he said finally, his voice lower now, more measured. "This city eats people alive when they walk in without watching their step." "And maybe," she replied, chin lifting, "the city wouldn't be so cruel if men like you stopped feeding it." Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. For the first time, Alexander looked unsettled, not by what she had said, perhaps, but by the fact that she had said it at all. Most people avoided his gaze. She didn't. Most people softened their tone, hers sharpened. Most people wanted something from him, she wanted nothing. It irritated him, it intrigued him. It left him standing there, folder in hand, watching a woman who didn't seem to care that she just poked the lion in his den. Finally, she exhaled. "Look, I've had a long day, I'm not here to fight. Just give the folder to Dempsey, he'll know what it's for." She turned to leave. "Wait." The word was sharper than he intended. She stopped, but didn't face him. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Evelyn Hart. Do you work for Halpern and Lowe?" "Sometimes. Contract work." He studied her back, the set of her shoulders, the straightness of her spine. No hesitation. No apology. Just a woman who had walked into his world and refused to bend. She walked away before he could think of what to say next. The elevator doors slid shut, swallowing her whole, leaving only the faint scent of rain and defiance behind. Alexander stood in the empty reception area, folder still in his hand, unsettled in a way he hadn't been in years. Business adversaries didn't shake him. Global crises didn't rattle him. But that woman, that waitress-looking, ordinary, stubborn woman, had just lodged herself in his thoughts like a splinter under skin. He didn't like it. Evelyn, meanwhile, stepped out into the rain-soaked streets, her pulse unsteady. She scolded herself under her breath. What had possessed her to speak to him like that? Alexander Crane, one of the most powerful men in the city. She could lose her contract with Halpern and Lowe in an instant if word got back to her boss. And yet something in her chest felt alive, a spark she hadn't felt in years. Not admiration, not attraction, something closer to indignation, sharpened by curiosity. His eyes, she couldn't shake the way they had pinned her as if trying to peel her apart. She didn't like it. Either, that night both of them lay awake in separate corners of the city. Alexander at his penthouse, glass of bourbon untouched beside him. Evelyn in her small apartment, rain tapping against the window like a restless thought. Neither wanted to admit it, but both found themselves replaying the same moment, the clash, the words, the look. It hadn't been love at first sight. It hadn't even been respect. It was something else. Something neither of them had asked for. Something neither of them could ignore. The city, for once, seemed to hold its breath, because two storms had crossed paths and the air between them was charged. Alexander Crane was not a man who lingered on strangers. His world was built on precision, on removing distractions before they had a chance to interrupt his rhythm. He dealt in numbers, contracts, percentages. People, outside his circle of influence, were variables to be managed, not puzzles to be solved. And yet, the woman's face wouldn't leave him. Evelyn Hart. He repeated the name to himself as if testing the syllables for weakness. It sounded ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of name that might appear in the corner of a forgotten yearbook or on the receipt of a grocery store transaction. Yet something about it clung to him like rainwater that refused to dry. That night, he tried to drown the thought in work. The conference table in his penthouse was scattered with reports, market projections, and a laptop screen that glowed past midnight. His analysts expected decisions by morning, decisions that would ripple across thousands of jobs, millions of dollars. Normally, he thrived in that clarity, but tonight the numbers blurred, slipping into the shape of gray eyes that had met his without flinching. "You don't leave sensitive contracts lying around," he had snapped. "And maybe the city wouldn't be so cruel if men like you stopped feeding it," she had answered. The words replayed, not because of their content. He'd heard sharper insults from rivals, but because of the steadiness in her voice. No tremor, no flattery, no fear. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him like that. The next morning, his assistant noticed his distraction. "Are you all right, Mr. Crane?" she asked carefully as he reviewed a set of proposals. "I'm fine," he said, too quickly. His tone snapped like a whip, and she retreated. But the irritation was aimed at himself. Not her fine, he was not fine. He was restless, and restlessness was dangerous for a man who thrived on control. By Friday, he had already made 3 unnecessary calls to Dempsey under the pretense of clarifying the documents Evelyn had delivered. Each time, he half expected to hear her voice on the line. Each time, disappointment laced the silence when she didn't answer. What was wrong with him? She was nothing. A contract worker, a woman who folded aprons and signed visitor passes. She wasn't polished, wasn't tailored, didn't belong in his world. And maybe that was the problem. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself drawn to something he couldn't own, measure, or predict. A silence in her that matched his own, but unbroken by wealth. Across the city, Evelyn felt the aftershock too, though she hated admitting it. She told herself she had forgotten him, that arrogant man with his expensive suit and colder eyes. But on the subway ride to work, her reflection betrayed her. She caught herself staring at the opposite window, remembering the sharp line of his jaw, the way he had demanded her name. It infuriated her. Men like him were trouble disguised as opportunity. They consumed everything and gave nothing. She had been burned once, and the scars still ached when she thought about trust. Alexander Crane was not someone she could afford to remember. And yet she did. At the diner, when a customer snapped his fingers for service, her mind flashed back to Alexander's raised brow, the silent challenge in his stare. At the law office, when her boss asked her to deliver another set of contracts uptown, she caught herself praying it wouldn't be to Crane's building again. The thought of seeing him unsettled her, not because she feared him, but because she feared herself. That week passed in uneasy parallel. Alexander worked through board meetings and power lunches, but in the quiet moments, an elevator ride, the lull before a presentation, Evelyn's voice echoed. Evelyn, who had looked at him not as a billionaire, not as a name, but as a man she had no interest in pleasing. By Saturday night, he broke his own rule. He typed her name into a search bar, Evelyn Hart. The results were underwhelming, a LinkedIn profile half-finished, an outdated photo in which she looked younger, brighter. No articles, no photographs at galas, no record of success or scandal. She existed, but barely. A ghost of the digital age. It should have bored him. Instead, it intrigued him. In a world where everyone screamed for attention, she remained silent. What kind of person chose invisibility? The irony didn't escape him. He who had been betrayed for his visibility, now chasing a woman who seemed allergic to it. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat in her small apartment with a book in her lap unread. She kept telling herself to forget, to move on, to file the memory of Alexander Crane alongside every other powerful man who had crossed her path. But forgetting wasn't working. Something about him had pierced her defenses, not his wealth, not his reputation, but the moment their hands had brushed and she had seen, just for an instant, the weariness in his eyes. It wasn't attraction, she told herself. It was recognition. Two broken people passing each other on opposite streets, each pretending they weren't limping. Still, recognition was dangerous. It pulled at her, like a current beneath still water. By Sunday, both had convinced themselves the moment would fade, that life would carry them forward, and the memory would dissolve. Yet neither could shake the suspicion that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because curiosity is the seed fate plants before it blooms into something neither logic nor pride can contain. And both Alexander Crane and Evelyn Hart, though they didn't admit it, were already watering that seed with every thought they tried to suppress. Wounds don't announce themselves. They leak through in small ways, an unfinished sentence, a glance too quickly averted, the way someone stiffens at the wrong word. Both Alexander and Evelyn carried theirs like invisible scars, hidden well enough for strangers, but not well enough for each other. It began with coincidence, or so it seemed. Evelyn was assigned again to deliver contracts to Crane International. She considered asking her boss to send someone else, but pride stopped her. Why should she be the one to flinch? She told herself she didn't care. But as the elevator climbed, her pulse betrayed her, drumming against her ribs like fists on a locked door. Alexander had not expected to see her again either. When she stepped into his office for the second time, folder in hand, he almost convinced himself the universe was mocking him. Yet his reaction was swift, undeniable. Something inside him jolted awake. She handed over the documents with brisk efficiency, avoiding his gaze. He, in turn, studied her carefully. The lines beneath her eyes suggested long hours. Her blouse, neatly pressed but modest, spoke of practicality, not vanity. She looked like someone who fought for dignity in a world eager to strip it away. "Thank you, Ms. Hart," he said, his tone measured. This time she met his eyes. "You're welcome, Mr. Crane." The formality was deliberate, a wall she placed between them. He recognized it instantly because he lived behind walls himself. What neither of them knew was how quickly those walls would begin to crack. The first Fisher appeared at the law office. Evelyn was reviewing paperwork when her boss raised his voice, sharp, cutting. He accused her of misfiling a clause. She knew she hadn't. The mistake was his. But she swallowed the retort, lowered her gaze, and endured the reprimand in silence. Later, she stepped into the restroom, locked the door, and pressed her hands against the sink until her knuckles whitened. She didn't cry. She hadn't in years. But the reflection in the mirror was enough to remind her. She had learned to survive by choosing battles, and sometimes survival looked like surrender. Alexander, coincidentally, was in the same building that afternoon. He had come to finalize a deal with Halpern and Lowe. When he passed the corridor and saw her leaving the restroom, face pale, shoulders squared with effort, he noticed. He said nothing then, but the image followed him into the meeting like an unwelcome ghost. His own wound revealed itself days later. Evelyn had been called back to his office with another folder. When she entered, he was already arguing on the phone. His voice was sharp, but underneath something cracked. "I don't care what she wants. She signed the contract. If she thinks she can walk away, she'll regret it." The line went dead. He exhaled, rubbed his forehead, then froze when he saw her standing there. "Sorry," he muttered, an unusual word in his vocabulary. "Rough call?" she asked, unable to keep curiosity from her tone. He gave a short laugh, humorless. "They always are." She studied him for a moment longer, noting the way his shoulders slumped once the performance ended. The sight unsettled her. For all his power, he looked tired, not physically, but in his marrow. And for a fraction of a second, something unspoken passed between them, recognition. That night, Alexander found himself remembering details he shouldn't have noticed. The way Evelyn's hands trembled slightly when she passed him the folder, though her voice never shook. The way she carried herself as if the world had already knocked her down, but she decided to stand anyway. It mirrored something in himself he didn't want to face. Evelyn, meanwhile, replayed the sound of his voice after the call, the harshness, the hollow beneath it. She wondered who the she had been. A client? A lover. Whoever it was, the bitterness in his tone had been raw, almost painful. For the first time, she glimpsed not the CEO in his tailored armor, but the man underneath. She hated that it stirred something in her. Over the next weeks, their encounters multiplied. Always professional, always accidental, but each leaving behind a residue that clung longer than it should. And with each meeting, another wound revealed itself. For him, the way he avoided questions about his personal life, deflecting with brusque efficiency. For her, the way she bristled at any offer of help as if kindness itself were a trap. At first, they pretended not to notice, but it grew harder to ignore. One evening, as Evelyn left the building, Alexander caught her at the elevator. "MS, Hart," he said, almost hesitant. "Do you ever regret it?" She blinked. "Regret what?" "Trusting the wrong people." The question startled her. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Then, softly, "Every day, but regret doesn't return what's gone." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside, leaving him with her answer. He didn't move until long after the doors closed. Both of them carried wounds shaped by betrayal, sharpened by loss. Neither wanted to admit it, but like cracks in glass, the fractures were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before they collided again, harder, deeper, breaking through defenses neither had planned to surrender. For Alexander, curiosity was no longer enough. He wanted to know the story behind her silence. For Evelyn, denial was no longer enough. She wanted to know what lived beneath his steel. Wounds had begun to speak even when words failed, and fate, patient and merciless, was listening. Life has a way of tying knots where people least want them. For Alexander and Evelyn, that knot came in the form of necessity, an unavoidable, inconvenient entanglement that neither could cut loose. The deal that set it in motion was one Alexander considered critical. Crane International was hosting a charity gala that doubled as a negotiation stage with foreign investors. Contracts, legal oversight, and flawless execution mattered more than the champagne or music. Halpern and Lowe, The modest firm where Evelyn worked was brought in for a portion of the legal review. Normally, she handled background paperwork far from any spotlight. But this time, due to staff shortages, she was assigned as direct liaison. When her boss handed her the file, Evelyn froze. The name on the first page was bold, inescapable, Crane International. "You'll attend the gala," her boss said flatly, not asking, not caring about her hesitation. "Make sure the final paperwork transitions smoothly. Don't embarrass me." She wanted to protest, to say she wasn't suited for high-gloss events or conversations in rooms dripping with wealth, but refusing wasn't an option. Rent didn't forgive pride. On the evening of the gala, Evelyn arrived at the hotel ballroom wearing a borrowed dress from her sister. Navy blue, simple, with sleeves that brushed her wrists. She'd pinned her hair back, smoothed her nerves, and told herself she was here to work, not to be noticed. Alexander noticed anyway. From across the ballroom, amid glittering gowns and black tie elegance, she stood out not for extravagance but for restraint. While others sparkled, she remained steady. No diamonds, no rehearsed laughter, just calm eyes scanning the room, a professional with nothing to sell. When their gazes met, the memory of every charged word they had exchanged returned. For a beat too long, he forgot the investors at his side. "Mr. Crane," one of them prompted. He blinked, adjusted his cufflink, and excused himself. By the time he reached her, Evelyn was flipping through the contract notes, pretending she hadn't seen him. "You clean up well," he said quietly. She looked up, startled by his proximity. "I didn't come here to be evaluated. And yet," he murmured, "I can't seem to stop." Her eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, a colleague called her over to finalize a clause. Work intruded, saving her from answering and saving him from revealing more than he intended. The night unfolded with forced proximity. They were seated at the same table, their knees brushing beneath crisp linen. They were asked to consult on a clause together, leaning too close over shared pages. Every encounter pulled them into the same orbit, a reluctant gravity neither could escape. At one point, during a break in the negotiations, Evelyn stepped onto the terrace for air. The city stretched below in glittering veins of light. She wrapped her arms around herself, grateful for the chill that cut through the stifling ballroom. Alexander followed. "You hate these things," he observed. She didn't turn. "How would you know? Because I hate them too." She glanced at him then, searching for sarcasm. None. His face was earnest, a rare unguarded moment. "These events are masks," he continued. "Deals dressed as dinners, power disguised as charity. I don't belong in them, but I've learned to perform." Her lips curved faintly. "And you think I don't perform?" "You don't," he said simply. Silence stretched, the air between them thinned, heavy not with words, but with what they refused to name. Finally, she turned back to the city. "You're wrong. I perform every day, just not the way you do." Something in her tone, soft, raw, made him want to ask more, but before he could, they were called back inside. The evening ended in success. Contracts were signed, hands were shaken, cameras flashed. From the outside, Crane International had won another flawless victory. Inside, Alexander felt shaken, not by the deal, but by Evelyn's presence lingering beside him like a second pulse. Later, as guests trickled out and the ballroom dimmed, he found her again. She was packing up documents, her borrowed dress catching the last of the light. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. "Funny," she replied without looking up. "I wasn't trying to impress you." "I know." His voice softened. "That's why you did." She paused, folder in hand. For the first time, her defenses wavered. There was no witty retort, no wall of distance, only silence, heavy and uncertain. Finally, she spoke. "Don't mistake tolerance for trust, Mr. Crane." And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone in the cavernous room, unsettled in a way contracts and markets never managed. That night, Evelyn replayed the evening in her small apartment. The music, the glittering crowd, the moment on the terrace when his words almost reached her. She told herself it was nothing. She was nothing to him. He was nothing to her. But her heartbeat refused to quiet. Across the city, Alexander stood at his penthouse window, tie loosened, glass in hand. He thought of her words, "Don't mistake tolerance for trust." For years, people had offered him both too easily. Trust purchased, tolerance traded. But hers had been earned grudgingly, honestly, and that made it worth more than all the contracts in the world. They had been forced into the same space, bound by necessity, not choice, yet the night had shifted something, from opposition to tolerance, from strangers to reluctant allies, from silence to the first threads of understanding. And though neither admitted it, both knew, once a knot is tied, it is never undone without leaving a mark. Closeness doesn't always arrive with a touch. Sometimes it slips in through silence, through words spoken too softly to be performance, through the cracks people try hardest to hide. For Alexander and Evelyn, that moment came not in a ballroom, but in the quiet aftermath of exhaustion. The gala had ended, the investors departed, the contract sealed. Days later, Evelyn was called again to Crane International for follow-up documentation. She told herself it was routine, paperwork, nothing more. Yet as she stepped into the building's marble lobby, a restlessness twisted in her stomach. She hated that she cared. The receptionist led her to a smaller conference room, not the towering office where she had first met him, but an understated space lined with bookshelves and a long oak table. Alexander was already there, jacket off, tie loosened. He looked less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man who had finally run out of polish. "You're late," he said, though his tone lacked its usual sharpness. "Traffic," she replied simply, sliding the file across the table. He skimmed it, nodded, then closed the folder without a word. For a long moment he just sat there, elbows resting on the table, gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. She almost asked what was wrong, but pride stopped her. It wasn't her business. Then he broke the silence himself. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" The question startled her. She studied him, trying to decide whether he was serious. His face gave nothing away, but his voice carried a weight that couldn't be faked. "Every day," she admitted before she could stop herself. Their eyes met. For the first time, the exchange wasn't sharp, wasn't defensive. It was naked, like two people holding up their scars for each other to see. He leaned back, exhaling. "I built everything I thought I wanted, and yet half the time, I can't breathe in it." She hesitated. Then, "I lost everything I thought I needed, and sometimes I wonder if I'll ever trust myself enough to try again." The words hung between them, fragile and electric. It wasn't a confession of love. It wasn't even intimacy, not in the way the world defined it. But it was closeness, the kind born not from desire, but from recognition. Minutes stretched. Neither rushed to fill the silence. It was Evelyn who finally broke it, her voice softer than usual. "You looked tired the other night at the gala." "I was." He gave a rueful smile, tired of pretending. She tilted her head. "Isn't that what people like you do best? Pretend?" He almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Yes, but even masks get heavy after a while." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos. She unscrewed the lid, poured steaming liquid into the small metal cap, and slid it toward him. "Coffee?" He blinked, caught off guard. "I have a machine worth more than your rent." "Then you've probably forgotten what real coffee tastes like." Her lips curved faintly. "Try it." He did. The brew was strong, imperfect, slightly bitter, but it was real, more real than the curated Cabernet in his cellar, more real than the espresso that hissed from chrome machines in his office suite. For a second, something in him softened. He felt almost human again. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shrugged, as if brushing away the weight of his gratitude, but the faintest warmth lingered in her eyes. They didn't touch. They didn't move closer across the table, and yet both left that room changed. For Alexander, it was the first time in years he had spoken honestly about the suffocation of success. For Evelyn, it was the first time in years she had admitted aloud the terror of starting over. When she left the building, the city felt different, less hostile, more alive. The rain had stopped, and the sidewalks glittered in the fading light. She walked with a strange heaviness in her chest, the kind that wasn't burden but awareness. Across the city, Alexander returned to his penthouse and found himself staring at the untouched decanter of bourbon. He poured it out, replaced it with coffee from the thermos she had left behind. It wasn't the taste he craved. It was the reminder that something genuine still existed. That night, neither of them slept easily. Not because of insomnia, not because of nightmares, but because their thoughts were full of each other. Not attraction, not fantasy, something quieter, more dangerous. The recognition that they had begun to matter. Days later, Alexander found himself replaying the sound of her voice in his head. I lost everything I thought I needed. The admission echoed in him, brushing against his own fears. He wondered what it had cost her to say it, wondered if she regretted letting him see that piece of her. Evelyn, in turn, kept remembering his face when he asked, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" The question haunted her not because she didn't know the answer, but because he had dared to voice it. Men like him weren't supposed to feel that way, yet he did. And that made him less of an icon, more of a man. Closeness had begun to weave itself in threads invisible to both of them. No contracts, no obligations. Just the fragile, terrifying honesty of two people admitting they were broken in different ways. Neither said it aloud, but both knew, once truth is shared, it can't be taken back. And truth has a way of pulling people closer, whether they want it or not. Trust is fragile. It grows slowly, molecule by molecule, and breaks all at once. For Alexander and Evelyn, the fracture came on a night that should have been ordinary. The documents Evelyn had been reviewing for Crane International were nearly complete. She stayed late at the law office, eyes aching under fluorescent light, fingers smudged with ink. Her boss had been unusually anxious about the project, pacing the halls, snapping at assistants. Evelyn thought nothing of it until she saw her name typed where it didn't belong. She froze. Her name had been inserted into a clause, attaching her as a witness to a deal she hadn't approved. Her signature forged, her reputation tethered to a contract that bent dangerously toward illegality. Confusion burned into dread. She flipped through the pages, scanning faster, heart racing. The deal was sound on the surface, but hidden deep was a backdoor clause, a funnel of money that would benefit not the charity but private accounts. If signed, it would implicate her. And at the center of it all, Crane International. Her stomach dropped. Had she been played? Was this the reason Alexander had shown interest in her? The reason he'd offered glimpses of vulnerability? The memory of their conversation about masks, about regret soured instantly. Don't mistake tolerance for trust, she had told him, and maybe she had been right. That night, Evelyn barely slept. By morning, she had made a decision: confront him. Alexander was in his office when she arrived, storm in her step, folder clutched like a weapon. He looked up from his desk, surprise flickering at her unannounced entry. "Evelyn," he began, but she cut him off. "Don't," she snapped. "Don't say my name like you have the right to." His brows furrowed. "What's going on?" She slapped the folder onto his desk, pages spilled across the glass surface. "Explain this." He scanned the papers, confusion etched into his face. "These aren't." "Don't lie," she hissed. Her voice trembled not with fear but with fury. "My name is in here, my signature. You think I wouldn't notice?" His gaze lifted, sharp. "You think I did this?" "Who else?" Throat tightened. "You wanted me involved, and now I see why. You don't need people, you use them. I should have known." For a moment, silence hung heavy. His face hardened, the mask slamming back into place. "You don't know me," he said coldly. "I thought I did," she whispered. The words cut deeper than accusation. He had expected anger, but not the quiet ache behind it. "I didn't forge this," he said at last, each word clipped. "If your name was used, it wasn't by me. I don't need to manipulate a contract to get what I want." She laughed bitterly. "You're right, you don't need to, you just crush whatever's in your way." The silence stretched, jagged. He wanted to reach across the desk, to tear down the misunderstanding, to tell her she was wrong, but pride pinned his tongue. He had spent too many years protecting himself from betrayal, and now here she was, accusing him of the very sin that haunted him. "Leave," he said finally. Her breath hitched, but she lifted her chin. "Gladly." She turned, heels striking sharp against the marble floor, each step an unspoken severing. When the door closed, Alexander sat motionless, staring at the scattered papers. His chest burned, not with guilt, but with the unbearable weight of being misunderstood again. That night, Evelyn sat in her apartment, staring at her hands. She replayed every moment with him, the coffee she had poured, the terrace conversation, the way his voice had softened. Was it all a game? Or worse, was it real, and she had been a fool for believing? Her phone buzzed with messages from her boss demanding her silence. The warning was clear: stay quiet or lose everything again. Tears pressed at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry for him, not for the man who had reminded her of everything she'd sworn never to trust again. Across the city, Alexander poured a glass of bourbon he didn't drink. He paced the penthouse, shadows stretching across the walls. He wanted to call her to demand she believe him, to confess that he had trusted her in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in years. But the words lodged in his throat. Vulnerability had cost him once. He couldn't afford it again, so he did nothing, and silence grew between them like a canyon. The world outside moved on, markets shifted, the city pulsed, but for them everything had stopped. For Evelyn, the betrayal reopened every scar she had fought to close. For Alexander, the accusation reopened the oldest wound of all, the fear that no one could ever see the man behind the empire without assuming the worst. They were both right, they were both wrong, and neither could forgive, not yet. So they walked away, carrying the weight of words unsaid, of trust broken before it had the chance to bloom. That night both wrote messages they never sent. His read, "It wasn't me." Hers read, "I wanted to believe you." Both deleted. And in the silence that followed, the fragile closeness they had built collapsed into ruin. Separation does not always come with slammed doors or shouted words. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by silence, by the absence of voices that once mattered. For Alexander and Evelyn, their parting wasn't a moment but a stretch of days that hardened into weeks, each one a slow ache neither could escape. Evelyn withdrew first. She stopped answering calls from the office when assignments related to Crane International surfaced. She traded shifts at the diner to avoid the routes that passed his glass tower. At night, when her phone vibrated with messages from her boss, she answered curtly, her words clipped, mechanical. The distance became a shield, though it weighed heavier than she admitted. Yet even as she built walls, she betrayed herself in small ways. In the mornings, she found her mind drifting to the sound of his voice, not the cold one that had sent her away, but the weary one that had once admitted. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" She hated that she remembered, hated that it echoed in her long walks home. At the diner, she caught herself glancing at men in tailored suits, searching for his shoulders, his stride, the particular sharpness of his profile. Every time she realized what she was doing, shame burned through her. She wasn't supposed to miss him, not him. But missing doesn't ask permission. Alexander pretended harder. To the board, he was unchanged, decisive, commanding, relentless. But behind the mask, the fracture widened. He found himself staring too long at empty chairs during meetings, imagining her seated across from him, her steady gaze cutting through the polished lies of the men around him. Nights were worse. He stood by the penthouse windows, city lights sprawling endlessly below, and wondered if she was awake somewhere, cursing his name or remembering the moments that had nearly pulled them together. He thought of the thermos of coffee, the way her lips had curved when she'd said, "You've probably forgotten what real coffee tastes like." He hadn't forgotten. He couldn't. Twice he typed her number into his phone. Twice he deleted it before pressing call. The words felt impossible. "It wasn't me. I didn't forge your name. I don't want to lose you." They lingered on the tip of his tongue, but fear anchored them. Too many betrayals had taught him, when trust falters, words don't matter. Proof doesn't matter. Only silence remains. So he chose silence. Their separation was not clean. It bled into every corner of their lives. Evelyn found herself writing messages late at night, lines she never sent. "I wanted to believe you," or "Tell me it wasn't true." Each time, she erased them before her pride could slip further. Alexander, too, wrote drafts of explanations on his laptop, half-crafted apologies that he abandoned after reading them back. They sounded weak, pathetic, unlike the man he had built himself to be. Vulnerability had already cost him once in his youth. He would not risk that humiliation again. And yet the cost of silence was no lighter. One evening, Evelyn stayed late at the law office, stacks of contracts blurring before her. As she turned off the lamp, her gaze lingered on the skyline beyond the window. His tower glowed among the others, cold and brilliant, untouchable. She whispered into the empty room, "Why did you let me believe the worst?" The question went unanswered. That same night, Alexander stood on his balcony, bourbon untouched in his hand. He whispered into the wind, "Why didn't you trust me?" The city swallowed the words whole, leaving only the hum of traffic below. In their separate loneliness, they mirrored each other. Both replayed the same arguments, the same accusations, the same silence. Both wondered if the other lay awake, thinking the same thoughts. Both ached with the knowledge that something real had flickered between them, something neither had dared to name, and that it had been extinguished too soon. But pride is a stronger prison than steel. Neither reached out. Neither crossed the chasm. Instead, they lived in fragments. For Evelyn, the faint memory of his laugh on the terrace, the weight of his gaze across the ballroom, the honesty in his question about regret. For Alexander, the sound of her voice as she admitted losing everything, the defiance in her stare when she accused him, the trembling in her hands that betrayed her strength. Love, if it had been growing, was left to starve in silence. Weeks blurred. Life went on. Contracts signed, bills paid, trains boarded. To the world, nothing had changed. But beneath the routines, both carried a hollow shaped like each other. And yet neither could admit it. To admit it would be to confess weakness, to reopen wounds too tender to touch. So they endured, strangers again, though every breath reminded them they were not. Sometimes silence is louder than words. Sometimes absence becomes a presence of its own. For Alexander and Evelyn, separation was not an ending but a haunting. And haunting has a way of circling back, because the past is patient, it waits, it tests, and soon it would place them face to face again, this time with stakes neither of them could ignore. The past never knocks politely, it barges in, loud and uninvited, reminding you that time is a circle, not a line. For Alexander and Evelyn, the past arrived in different forms, but its weight pressed them both toward the same precipice. For Alexander, it came in the shape of a familiar name. Her name, Clara Vance. He hadn't spoken it in years, hadn't allowed himself to think it without bitterness. Clara had once been everything, his partner in business, his first great love, the woman who knew his dreams before they took shape. And she had been the one to betray him, walking away with his ideas, his contacts, his trust. Now she was back. It began with an email forwarded by his assistant. Clara's new firm wanted to collaborate on a joint venture. Her pitch was strategic, lucrative, irresistible to his board. Old wounds don't outweigh new profits, one director said. The others agreed. The numbers were too good to ignore. Alexander felt the old rage stirring, the scar beneath the scar. Clara had taken from him once. Now she was extending a hand as if nothing had happened. He told himself he didn't care. But when her name appeared on his calendar, lunch with Clara Vance, he couldn't deny the knot in his chest. For Evelyn, the past arrived more quietly but no less cruelly. Her landlord handed her a letter one evening, notice of rent increase. The numbers were brutal, more than she could manage with her diner shifts and contract work. The familiar dread returned, the same dread she had felt the day she lost her cafe. Failure loomed like a shadow, whispering that she was back at the beginning, fighting a battle she could never win. Her sister suggested moving in together. Friends offered couches, but Evelyn resisted. Pride held her ground. She would not be uprooted again, not because of someone else's decisions. She would find another way. That other way came in the form of an offer from her boss. A bigger role, more hours, more pay on one condition. She would have to commit full time to the Crane International account. The very account she had walked away from. She stood in her boss's office, the words echoing. Think it over, you need this, Evelyn, stability. Stability, a cruel word when it meant chaining herself again to the man she was trying to forget. Two choices, two returns. Alexander sat across from Clara in a private restaurant, their table half-lit by a chandelier. She smiled like nothing had passed between them, like the betrayal had been a misunderstanding lost to time. We were good together, she said. We could be good again. He sipped his wine, studying her face. Once her beauty had captivated him. Now it looked polished, practiced, like a mask painted too carefully. He felt nothing except for the faint irritation that he had once felt everything. He realized with a start that his thoughts were elsewhere, not on Clara, on Evelyn, on her quiet defiance, her unpolished honesty. Clara had perfected the art of saying what people wanted to hear. Evelyn had perfected the art of refusing to. For the first time, Alexander understood what he had left behind, not just trust, but truth. He ended the meeting quickly, citing business, not bitterness. But as he left, Clara's words lingered. "You'll come back, you always do." He clenched his jaw. No, not this time. Evelyn, meanwhile, stared at the offer letter long into the night. Rent overdue, bills stacked, choices shrinking. And there, at the center of it all, was his name again. Alexander Crane. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the conference room, the way he had spoken about masks and regret. For a heartbeat, she wanted to believe him again. But then she remembered the forged signature, the sting of betrayal. Still, practicality gnawed at pride. She needed the money. She needed stability. She needed to survive. When she signed the offer letter, her hands shook. Fate wasted no time. 2 weeks later, Evelyn walked into a boardroom at Crane International to deliver her first full-time assignment. She had told herself she was ready, that she could maintain distance, that professionalism would shield her. But when the door opened and Alexander entered, their eyes collided with the force of memory. For a long, aching second, the room dissolved. No board members, no contracts, just two people standing on the fault line of their unfinished story. He looked at her like a man seeing a ghost. She looked at him like a woman remembering a wound. Neither spoke. Then the meeting began, words clipped, papers shuffled. They didn't address each other directly, but the air between them crackled, every sentence charged with what they didn't say. Afterward, as the others filed out, Alexander paused at the door. His voice, low and strained, carried across the empty room. "You came back." Evelyn didn't look up from her papers. "For the work, not for you." But her voice trembled on the last word. He heard it. She knew he did. Their past hadn't ended. It had only paused. And now, with the return of old wounds and new choices, the pause had ended too. Confession rarely arrives with perfect timing. It comes late, after damage, after silence, after pride has already cost too much. For Alexander, the words he had buried for weeks finally tore free, not because he planned them, but because holding them any longer felt unbearable. It was after another long day of negotiations. The boardroom had emptied, leaving only the faint scent of cologne and coffee. Evelyn gathered her papers slowly, careful not to meet his eyes. Since her return to Crane International, their interactions had been clipped, professional, heavy with avoidance. They had spoken only when necessary, voices cool, eyes elsewhere. But avoidance is its own form of intimacy. The more they tried not to see each other, the more sharply they felt the pull. That evening, as she tucked the last folder into her bag, Alexander stepped back into the room. He had removed his tie, his shirt collar open. For once, he didn't look like the invincible CEO. He looked like a man carrying something too heavy for too long. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low. She stiffened. "Mr. Crane." The formality was a blade between them. He winced at it. "I need to speak with you." "I don't think that's wise." She adjusted her bag, preparing to leave. He moved closer, not enough to touch her, but enough to close the distance that had kept them strangers. "Then let me be unwise." Her eyes flicked to his, wary. "What could you possibly say that you haven't already?" The silence stretched. His jaw tightened, his hands flexed at his sides, and then with a breath that sounded like surrender, he spoke. "It wasn't me." She blinked. "What?" "The forged signature, the contract. I didn't do it." His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with something raw. "I should have fought harder to prove it, but pride," he broke off, swallowing. "Pride has ruined too many things in my life. I let it ruin us, too." Her throat tightened, the word us lodged in her chest like a thorn. "Why tell me now?" she whispered. "Because watching you walk away was harder than being accused, harder than being misunderstood." He exhaled shakily. "I told myself I didn't care, but I do. I care more than I know how to admit." Evelyn's heart pounded. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to, but trust was not a door easily reopened. "You expect me to forgive you because you finally decided to speak?" "No." His answer came quickly, almost desperate. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just need you to know the truth, because lying, by silence or by omission, is worse than losing you completely." Her eyes widened. She had braced for excuses, for charm, for the arrogance of a man who always won. But instead he offered something unthinkable, honesty without expectation. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked softly. "You don't need me, Alexander. You have an empire, power, wealth, women who would line up just to be near you." His gaze locked on hers. "And none of it means anything when you won't look at me." The words hit her harder than anger ever could. She felt her defenses trembling, the walls she had built beginning to crack. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why out of all the people in this city?" "Because you don't want anything from me," he said. His voice dropped, almost breaking. "Because you look at me and see a man, not a headline. Because when you handed me that cup of coffee, it was the first time in years I tasted something real. Because I am terrified that if you walk away again, I'll never find that again." Silence filled the room, thick and trembling. Evelyn's hands clenched around her bag strap. Every instinct told her to run, to protect herself, to remember the pain. But another voice, the quieter one buried deep, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was what she had been waiting to hear. Her lips parted. "You don't need me to stay, but what happens if I do?" For the first time, his mask shattered completely. Vulnerability spread across his face, unguarded, raw. He stepped closer, his voice barely more than a plea. "Then I'm not alone anymore." Her breath caught. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet. It wasn't poetry or promise. It was something far more dangerous, truth. She turned away, blinking hard, fighting the surge of emotion. "You don't make this easy." "I was never meant to," he said quietly. "But I'm trying. For the first time in my life, I'm trying without knowing the outcome." When she finally faced him again, their eyes locked, unflinching. Neither spoke, but something shifted in the space between them. Not forgiveness, not resolution, but the beginning of a possibility. She didn't promise to stay. He didn't beg for more. But in that unfinished silence, both knew the story wasn't over. And for the first time, neither wanted it to be. That night, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. His words replayed in her mind, each one tugging at her carefully guarded heart. She wanted to believe. She wanted to be wrong about him. Across the city, Alexander stood again at his glass window, but this time without bourbon in hand. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. Not because she had forgiven him, but because she finally knew the truth. The rest would be up to her. Forgiveness is not a sudden act. It is a decision made slowly, through clenched teeth and sleepless nights, through the grinding work of choosing understanding over pride. For Evelyn and Alexander, forgiveness did not arrive with a kiss or a dramatic gesture. It arrived in fragments, hesitant, fragile, and painfully real. Days passed after his confession. Evelyn replayed it endlessly, the way his voice cracked when he said none of it means anything when you won't look at me. She wanted to dismiss it as manipulation. Men like him were experts at saying what others wanted to hear, but something in his eyes, something unpolished and raw, kept intruding on her cynicism. Still, trust could not be forced. She kept her distance, speaking only when work required it. Yet every time she glanced up, she caught him watching her, not with the arrogance she had once despised, but with something quieter, patient. And that patience unnerved her more than any demand could. One evening, the office emptied early. Evelyn stayed behind, sorting files, grateful for the silence. She didn't hear the footsteps until he was there, leaning against the door frame. "You're working late," Alexander said softly. "So are you." She didn't look up. "Old habits," he admitted. "I used to think the longer I stayed in this building, the safer my empire was. But lately," he trailed off. "Lately what?" "Lately I think I stay because I'm afraid to go home." The honesty startled her. She set down her pen, finally meeting his eyes. They were weary, unguarded. He looked less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man finally admitting how heavy the crown had become. Something inside her softened, against her will, against her better judgment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "Because you're the only person I don't have to perform for." The words settled between them like a weight. She wanted to resist, to remind him of the pain he'd caused, the trust he'd broken, but her own scars ached in response. She knew what it was to wear armor too long, to suffocate inside a life built from fear. She exhaled slowly. "I don't forgive easily, Alexander. I wouldn't trust you if you did." The answer disarmed her. Forgiveness began in that moment, not complete, not spoken, but sparked by the realization that both were tired of fighting ghosts. Over the following weeks, their walls lowered in increments. Conversations grew less clipped, silences less hostile. Once, during a late-night project, she caught him watching her with an expression she didn't recognize. It wasn't hunger, wasn't possession. It was reverence. Another time, she brought him coffee again. He accepted it without words, but his hand lingered around the thermos as though it were something precious. Still, she tested him. When her boss pressured her into approving a questionable clause, she pushed back in front of Alexander, waiting to see if he would silence her. He didn't. Instead, he turned to the board and said, "She's right, strike it out." It was a small victory, but for Evelyn it was everything, not because he agreed, but because he stood beside her, not above her. One night, after another long meeting, they found themselves walking out together. The city air was sharp, headlights streaking across wet pavement. "I don't know how to do this," Evelyn admitted, surprising herself. "Do what? Trust someone again." Her voice caught. "Forgive someone and mean it." Alexander stopped walking. The traffic roared around them, but he looked at her as though the world had gone silent. "Then don't start with forgiveness," he said gently. "Start with understanding. Forgive me when you're ready. Until then, let me prove I'm worth it." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to retreat into cynicism, but the steadiness in his eyes left her defenseless, so she nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was permission for him to try, for her to hope. Over time, something new took root. Not the fragile spark of early attraction, not the brittle edges of distrust, but something sturdier. They spoke more freely, laughed occasionally, even disagreed without the room catching fire. Their scars remained, but instead of clashing, they began to align, two maps of pain that, when placed together, made sense. Evelyn realized she didn't have to erase the past to forgive. She only had to stop letting it dictate the future. Alexander realized he didn't need her to absolve him instantly. He only needed her to see that he was willing to fight, not for contracts, not for pride, but for her. Forgiveness, when it finally came, was not dramatic. It arrived on a quiet evening when Evelyn handed him a set of papers and said softly, "I believe you." No conditions, no fanfare, just 4 words that dissolved weeks of silence. Alexander's hand tightened around the folder, his throat working as if he couldn't breathe. "Thank you," he whispered, and for once the words didn't feel small. Forgiveness was not weakness. It was strength, hers, for choosing to let go of pain without forgetting it, his, for choosing to earn trust rather than demand it. It didn't erase their scars, but it allowed them to stand together, not as savior and saved, not as CEO and subordinate, but as two people who had finally chosen to stop being strangers. And though neither said it aloud, both understood. This was the beginning of something more enduring than desire. This was the beginning of commitment. Love, when it finally took shape between them, did not resemble the lightning strike of movies or the dizzying rush of youth. It looked quieter, steadier. It looked like two people learning to share space without surrendering themselves, like the patience of repairing what had once been broken. For Alexander, it began in small choices. He stopped staying at the office until dawn, started leaving at a reasonable hour. The first night he walked Evelyn home, it felt unfamiliar, this man who had always been chauffeured, now walking beneath streetlights, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles beside her. When she teased him for looking out of place on the cracked sidewalks, he only smiled. "I don't mind the cracks," he said. "They remind me the ground is real." For Evelyn, it began with trust in pieces. She let him carry her grocery bags once, even though she hated the idea of being seen as dependent. When he asked about the photographs tucked into the corner of her apartment mirror, her late father, her sister, she told him the stories, voice tight but steady. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions, didn't try to fix. He just listened. That was new, that was enough. Their relationship didn't bloom in passion alone. It grew in friction, too. Alexander struggled with control. Years of leading an empire had trained him to decide, to command, to shape outcomes. But Evelyn wasn't a company to be managed. When he tried to plan their evenings down to the minute, she pushed back. "Not everything needs an agenda," she said once, snatching the neatly written schedule from his hands and tossing it aside. He bristled, then laughed, really laughed, the sound startling even him. "You're impossible." "And you're insufferable," she replied, but her smile softened the words. In those clashes, they learned balance. He loosened his grip on control. She allowed herself to lean just slightly without fear of losing her footing. It wasn't easy. Shadows lingered. Sometimes Evelyn recoiled when his tone sharpened, memories of betrayal resurfacing without warning. Sometimes Alexander shut down when she pressed too hard, retreating into silence that echoed with his old scars. But each time they returned. Apologies were offered, explanations given, forgiveness extended not as weakness but as practice. They began to understand that love wasn't the absence of conflict, but the decision to remain through it. One evening, Alexander brought her to his penthouse, not as a showcase, but as a confession. "This is where I live," said as he opened the door, his voice strangely tentative. "But it's never felt like home." The space was immaculate, glass and marble gleaming under soft lights, but it was also sterile, curated like a museum no one touched. Evelyn walked slowly through the rooms, her footsteps echoing. "It's beautiful," she admitted, then glanced at him. "But empty." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "That's exactly what I've never been able to say." That night, she brewed coffee in his pristine kitchen, the smell filling the cold air with warmth. They sat on the floor instead of the leather sofa, mugs in hand, the city sprawled beneath them. For the first time, the penthouse felt less like a fortress and more like a place where someone could breathe. Togetherness became a practice, not a promise. They shared mornings when she rushed to work and he grabbed his tie at the last minute, evenings when they disagreed over dinner and laughed anyway, quiet Sundays when neither spoke but both felt understood. Theirs was not the story of perfection, it was the story of persistence. Once, late at night, Evelyn asked him a question that had haunted her since the beginning. "Do you still believe you can buy anything you want?" He looked at her for a long time, then shook his head. "Not anymore. The things I want now aren't for sale." "And what are those?" she pressed. He reached across the table, brushed his fingers against hers. "This, you, a life I don't have to perform." Her throat tightened. She didn't answer with words, only squeezed his hand. Their love was not fireworks. It was a slow-burning fire, steady and resilient. They no longer needed to test each other's walls. They had learned to live within them together. For Evelyn, it was the discovery that strength didn't mean isolation. For Alexander, it was the revelation that vulnerability didn't mean defeat. They were not whole, they were not healed, but they were moving forward, and that was enough. One morning, as they walked side by side down a crowded Manhattan street, she glanced at him and realized something startling. She was no longer bracing for betrayal. The fear lingered, yes, but it no longer ruled her. And Alexander, catching her gaze, realized something too. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. Their lives remained complicated, imperfect, full of old scars. But love had become less about rescue and more about commitment. Less about grand declarations and more about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard. Because in the end, love wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to carry it together. Happily ever afters belong to fairy tales. Real lives end differently, unfinished, uncertain, threaded with hope and doubt in equal measure. For Alexander and Evelyn, their ending was not a conclusion but a doorway, a threshold they stepped across together with no map to guide them. It was a quiet morning in late autumn when the city felt almost tender. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the air sharp and clean, the streets scattered with gold and red leaves. Evelyn woke in her small apartment to the sound of coffee brewing, her coffee in her chipped pot but poured by hands that had once known only crystal and steel. Alexander moved around her kitchen with awkward familiarity. He had traded his suit for a sweater, his phone for silence. Watching him there in her space, she felt the strangest combination of peace and disbelief. This was the same man whose name towered across skyscrapers, whose signature shifted markets. And yet here he was, carefully pouring coffee into mismatched mugs as if the ritual mattered more than any boardroom victory. He handed her a mug and sat across from her at the small table. The sunlight caught in his hair, softening the sharpness of his face. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. "Do you ever think," Evelyn said finally, "that this is the real life?" Not the boardrooms, not the contracts, just this, coffee at a kitchen table. Alexander studied her, his expression thoughtful. If it is, then it's the first real thing I've had in a very long time. Her chest tightened, but she didn't look away. It won't always be this simple. I know. His voice carried no hesitation. But I'd rather face complicated with you than empty without you. The day unfolded with no fanfare. They walked together through Central Park, leaves crunching underfoot. Children chased each other near the fountain, joggers passed with headphones in, life carrying on as if the world hadn't shifted for them. At one point, Evelyn paused on a bridge, leaning against the railing. The skyline stretched beyond the trees, familiar and imposing. She thought of everything that had brought them here: loss, betrayal, silence, confessions whispered too late. And still, somehow, they stood side by side. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Letting me back in?" Alexander's gaze followed hers across the skyline. "I regret the time I wasted before I told you the truth, but no, not for a second." The certainty in his voice shook her. It wasn't grand or romantic. It was steady, like bedrock beneath shifting earth. She nodded slowly. "Then maybe I can stop regretting, too." Their hands found each other's, tentative at first, then firm, not clinging, not desperate, just steady. That evening they returned to his penthouse. Evelyn had always hated the glass walls, the sterile perfection. But now, with him beside her, the space felt less like a museum and more like a canvas. They ordered takeout instead of dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, sat barefoot on the floor instead of behind the glossy dining table. He let her choose the music, something soft, something human. At one point, Alexander leaned back, watching her laugh at an old story, and thought, this is what it means to belong. He didn't say it aloud. Some truths are better lived than spoken. Later, as the city lights flickered against the glass, Evelyn asked a question that had lingered unspoken for months. "Do you think we'll last?" He turned to her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I know I'll fight for it, for us, every day." Her throat tightened. She had expected reassurance, promises, maybe even arrogance. But honesty, bare and uncertain, was what she needed most. "Then maybe that's enough," she whispered. They didn't plan a future that night. They didn't talk of marriage or forever. Instead, they sat together, watching the city breathe, content to let the moment carry them forward. Because love, they had learned, wasn't about certainty. It was about choice, about waking each morning and choosing to stay even when leaving might be easier. Weeks later, Evelyn moved a small stack of books into his penthouse. Just a stack, nothing more. He didn't comment, didn't push. He only cleared a shelf and made space. That act quiet. For her part, she began to walk more comfortably beside him in public. No longer as the outsider, not yet as the partner the world expected, but as herself, unapologetic, grounded. And Alexander, instead of hiding her, seemed proud to stand with her as though she was the most valuable contract he had ever signed. They were not perfect. They still argued. Old wounds still rose at inconvenient times, but they stayed. They learned. They tried. And that, in the end, became their version of happiness. Not the fairy tale, the real one. On a cold evening in December, as snow began to dust the city, they stood together on the balcony of his penthouse. The skyline glittered, the streets below alive with holiday lights. Evelyn slipped her hand into his, her breath clouding in the air. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" she asked softly. Alexander squeezed her hand. "Every day, but I don't need to know the whole story. Just the next page." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Then let's see where it goes." And there, high above a city that had once kept them apart, they stood, not as CEO and survivor, not as predator and prey, not as adversaries or strangers, but as two people, scarred and imperfect, daring to step into a future they couldn't predict. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning disguised as one. Because love, in the end, wasn't about arriving at a destination. It was about walking into uncertainty together. And though Evelyn didn't know it yet, though Alexander hadn't found the courage to tell her, there was still one secret he had never spoken aloud. A secret that, when revealed, would test them once more. But that was another story.